When we think about the early European settlements in the New World, we might think about Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, or perhaps the early English settlers of Jamestown, Virginia. But these weren't the first settlements on the shores of North America. The first permanent settlement was founded by the Spanish in Florida at St. Augustine. This is the colonization of North America, the first settlement. In our program, we have three subject matter experts. Alan Taylor, professor of history, University of California, Davis, and author of American Colonies.
Spanish explorers going out into what was a great unknown for them were informed by fabulous legends, including that of Fountain of Youth, potentially. This was a legend that did exist in the Spanish-speaking world of the late 15th and early 16th century.
Brenda Stevenson, professor of history, UCLA.
The large majority of slaves throughout the period that we're looking at would have come from West Africa. Of course, the period of African slavery is extremely long. We start in the 15th century and we go all the way through almost the end of the 19th century.
Clarence Walker, professor of history, University of California, Davis.
The rationale, therefore, for the institution of slavery was at first cultural and later racial. The Native Americans constitute an entirely different problem, and that they are at home, they are indigenous. To enslave them created problems for the early colonists, be it in New England or in the southeastern part of the United States. It is also the case that the Native Americans, because of the disease environment, did not survive the onslaught of many European diseases, and many of them died. Those who did not die and who were enslaved in many instances were shipped to the West Indies, where they served as slaves.
This lovely coastal town that lies just south of Jacksonville was founded over 400 years ago, 42 years before the English colony of Jamestown, and 55 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. The beauty of our country's southeastern seaboard was first looked on by European eyes when Don Juan Ponce de Leon landed on Florida shores in 1513. It was he, in fact, who gave our southernmost state its name. He called it La Florida, which means land of flowers, and claimed it for Spain. In learning about the colonization of North America, we should understand what was going on at about the same time in our neighboring lands of Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean islands. Before establishing settlements in North America, Spain already had conquered and ruled over Mexico, the Caribbean islands, and parts of South America. Indian subjects to the Spanish crown in the New World numbered 20 million, while the population of Spain itself was only 7 million. The Spaniards conquered native peoples and forced them to work mining gold, tending cattle, and growing crops. By the time all North and South American territories were secured, the Spanish Empire in the Americas exceeded in size the Roman Empire at its peak.
The Spanish went into much bigger territories in relatively smaller numbers. And what they wanted to do was conquer native peoples, convert them to Catholicism, transform their way of life into one that resembled the Spanish, and put them to work on plantations and in mines and on ranches, working for the benefit of Spanish overlords who would be receiving tribute from these Indians.
But many Indians died from new diseases unintentionally introduced by the Spanish. A pre-conquest population in Mexico of 10 million natives dwindled to about 1 million by 1620. But the Spaniards grew rich by exploiting the mineral riches of Mexico and Peru. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain exported from the Americas back to their homeland 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver.
The Spanish shipping route would be from either Panama or from Veracruz on the Mexican coast, and it would proceed then to Havana in Cuba, where they would consolidate their convoy in order to protect these treasure ships. There would be military ships going along, and then these fleets would proceed northeastward along the coast of Florida, between Florida and the Bahamas, which are very tricky waters, prone to hurricanes. There are sandy shoals there. And so there were a fair number of ships that got shipwrecked, especially along the coast of Florida, before they would get further into the Gulf Stream and out into the Atlantic and the relative safety. It's also at that funnel point between the Bahamas and Florida that pirates would locate themselves, knowing that these treasure ships would be coming together and passing along that route.
Having established that bit of preceding history, we can continue with Spain's conquest of North America. Ponce de Leon arrived in Florida in 1513, seeking treasure and slaves to take to Cuba to work the plantations there. He found neither treasure nor the fabled Fountain of Youth in Florida, but he did find Indian slaves whom he carried away to Cuba, unintentionally leaving behind pathogens of disease that ravaged the native people. Between 1513, when Ponce de Leon first set foot on Florida soil, and 1563, the government of Spain launched 6 expeditions to Florida, none of which resulted in a permanent settlement. One of these, in 1540, led by Hernando de Soto, resulted in devastation to the native populations. His military technique was to capture the chief of the local Indian tribes and enslave the people.
Well, De Soto was a typical conquistador. These were tough men. They were ambitious men. They came from the Hidalgo class in Spain, which was the minor gentry. They were people who made their fortunes through military activity.
De Soto's army of about 600 men made its way north through Florida and on to the Mississippi River near present-day Memphis. No permanent Spanish settlements resulted from De Soto's incursions into North America.
Its purpose was not to colonize. His purpose was to go out and look and see what he could find and to make contact with native peoples, intimidate them, try to find out if they had gold or silver. And if they did, there would have been a follow-up expedition.
During the 1560s, however, French Protestants, known as Huguenots, built a base known as Fort Caroline on the east coast of Florida.
Their prime purpose was not to establish plantations or other agricultural enterprise, but to establish forts along the coast of Florida, which could be used as naval bases, from which they could sail out as pirates and attack the Spanish shipping that was coming up along the coast of Florida from the Caribbean heading to Europe via the Gulf Stream.
The French garrisons posed a threat for Spain's treasure fleet that sailed Florida's waters.
Then the King of Spain had 2 very powerful motives to send a powerful force to destroy that pirate base of French Protestants, both to root out these Protestants and make an example of them, but also to root out these pirates and make an example of them.
And so, Spain's King Philip II in 1564 sent one of his most experienced admirals to be governor of Florida. The man he chose was Don Pedro Menendez de Avilés.
And he would get his start by first destroying the start that the French had made at Fort Caroline as their pirate base to attack Spanish shipping.
Menendez arrived off the coast of Florida on August 28, 1565. It was the feast day of St. Augustine, which gave the city its name. He came ashore with his 600 soldiers and settlers, with banners flying and trumpets sounding. Following his charter, one of Menendez's first tasks was to drive out the French. His first attack against the French was at Fort Caroline at present-day Jacksonville, Florida.
But some of the Huguenots had been away from their fort at the time of the first massacre. They had been out in one of their pirate ships.
His second attack to drive out the Huguenots, whom the Catholic Spanish considered heretics, occurred near this location, where this small Spanish fort now stands.
The Spanish tracked them down there on the beach. The French surrendered, hoping that they would receive mercy, but instead they were all massacred, put to the sword, with the exception of a couple of them who insisted that they were Catholic.
This fortress, built starting in 1737, is named Fort Matanzas, a Spanish word that means slaughter, referring to the massacre that occurred not far from here. This and other coastal fortresses along the southeastern seaboard are reminders of the struggle between European nations to dominate the New World. It's important to understand why Europeans made the dangerous journey across the Atlantic and risked everything to find a new home in North America. Extreme forces in their homelands drove them. Starting in 1562, the wars of religion raged throughout France and continued through the 16th century. The royal families of both France and Spain were Catholic, and the rebellious Protestants were not tolerated. In Florida, at the same time in history, conflict also raged. In addition to the French Huguenots, the enemies of the Spanish also included English pirates. In 1586, the most famous and daring of the English pirates, Sir Francis Drake, led a raid against St. Augustine. This map, which dates to 1589, is the earliest printed chart of a European settlement in the New World. It depicts Sir Francis Drake's fleet of 25 ships off the coast of St. Augustine. Drake's men pillaged and burned the town, leaving many of the town's defenders dead. The Spanish, however, quickly regained control of the town and rebuilt St. Augustine.
His point wasn't to come and make permanent conquests. That would have been a far longer and more expensive proposition. He's out to make money. He's out to make money for himself and for his official sponsors. And the way to make that money is hit and run. And that's what he did at St. Augustine. He went in there, seized it, plundered it, and left. That was his method of operation.
In 1668, another destructive raid by a later English pirate, Captain John Davis, persuaded the Spanish that they needed to strengthen the fortifications of St. Augustine. The answer was this: Castillo de San Marcos. This is the oldest surviving stone fortress in the United States. This star-shaped fort, surrounded by a moat and earthworks, was built starting in 1672. The stone used in its construction comes from a nearby quarry. It's called coquina and consists of tightly compacted seashells fused together by the pressures of the earth. Cannonballs striking the coquina shattered it, but failed to crumble the walls. It took 23 years to complete Castillo de San Marcos, but once built, it became St. Augustine's stronghold against invaders. During the 18th century, British attacks repeatedly tested and proved the strength of San Marcos. An even stronger attack in 1749 resulted in the defeat of the forces of British General James Oglethorpe of Georgia. To this day, the fort has never fallen to enemy attack. The Spanish origins of St. Augustine are ever present. The Spanish architecture, street names and landmarks, and of course, the Catholic religion and the missions reflect the Spanish influence. In Florida and many other states of the Union, Catholic missions are found. They are living reminders of the Spanish and French efforts to spread Catholicism to the New World. With few exceptions, priests and missionaries accompanied Spanish expeditions of discovery to the New World. The first Mass celebrated in North America was no doubt offered by priests of Ponce de Leon's expedition. From the very first ventures of Europeans across the Atlantic to the New World, the Catholic governments of France and Spain had a joint mission to fulfill. This is the decree of the Church, dated 1532.
Whereas our principal intent in the discovery of new lands is that the inhabitants and natives thereof, who are without the light or knowledge of faith, may be brought to understand the truth of our holy Catholic faith, that they may come to a knowledge thereof, and become Christians, and be saved.
The Catholic Church publishes a list of nearly 100 missionaries killed by Indians or who somehow met their death in the course of their work. These names, some Spanish, some French, come from records dating back to 1542, before the founding of St. Augustine. Although hostility and violence was a part of settling the New World, it was not always the case. In many Indian chiefdoms, the Indians accepted the missionaries into their world. The missions and the local Indian tribes had a working relationship. While the Jesuit or Franciscan friars were in charge of religious matters, they gave the local Indian chief the authority in non-religious or secular matters. French and Spanish missions existed in the New World in virtually every region, from coast to coast. Wherever Indian tribes were, and they lived in every corner of North America, the missionaries were there also, often well ahead of European settlers. In some states, like Georgia, which had an extensive mission system, the missions have long been abandoned and destroyed by pirates or Indians. In other states, like California and Texas, the missions still stand and are in fact active places of worship.
You have promised to give us new life as well, a life that will never end.
But the Spanish missions in Florida had formidable enemies to the north. In the 1670s, the English established a new colony called Carolina. From their chief settlement at Charlestown, they developed a trade in Indian slaves. By offering trade goods, including guns, the Carolina traders recruited some Indian tribes to raid other Indian tribes to take captives for sale in Charlestown. The raiders included the Creek, Yamasee, and Savannah Indians. Well armed with English muskets, they regarded the poorly armed Indians of the Spanish missions in Florida as easy targets. Between 1680 and 1710, raids by English traders and their Indian allies destroyed almost all of the Spanish missions in Florida. The victors enslaved about 10,000 Florida Indians. The native population of Florida collapsed to only about 4,000 survivors by 1715. Without the missions, Spanish Florida became a hollow shell, little more than the single town of St. Augustine, with its one powerful fortress. There's another interesting footnote to the story of St. Augustine. The first free African American settlement to legally exist in North America was founded here. Fort Mose, established in 1738, gave sanctuary to Africans who ran away from their owners. The King of Spain issued a decree that gave Africans freedom if they would embrace Catholicism.
Giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and my liberality, others will do the same.
The Spanish therefore saw it in their interest to try to weaken Carolina, and one way by which they could do it was to encourage the slaves of the Carolinians to run away by providing them with a safe haven around St. Augustine. These runaway slaves, if they would embrace the Catholic religion and would agree to support the Spanish king, were given land, given their freedom, and they were placed primarily at a place called Fort Mose, which was north of St. Augustine.
Slavery was a reality from the very outset of the colonization of North America. African slaves were among the first settlers in the New World.
Well, actually, Africans came over with Columbus, so Africans were on all the first expeditions to the New World by Europeans.
Slaves were not only among the earliest of settlers. There was nothing that was, shall we say, foreordained that slavery would be a black institution in the United States. You had the option of enslaving the Native Americans, you had the option of enslaving blacks, and you could even have enslaved white people. But it is the collapse of the process of indentured servitude, which is a process whereby white people sold their labor for between 7 to 11 years to come to the New World, that creates a space for the creation of American Negro slavery. Black people, unlike the Europeans who labored with them in the fields of Virginia and Maryland and in other parts of the South, were not Christian, and they were outsiders, and therefore they could be enslaved.
While every colony except Georgia in North America sanctioned slavery, it was more common in some regions than others.
Slaveholding was always more important in the American South than it was in the North because it was more important to the economy of the American South.
Slavery became especially widespread in Carolina, which included both present-day North and South Carolina. The principal city was Charlestown, the present-day city of Charleston, South Carolina. Founded in 1670, the colony had a slave majority population by 1710.
The slave is a person without any sort of rights. The slave is socially dead. In law, there is no recognition of his family, of his past, of his history, of his very being. The slave is basically an instrument of his master's will.
Slaves who ran away to find freedom were called maroons. Many found refuge in Florida.
Maroon societies were those societies in which Africans, and sometimes Native populations as well, people of Native populations ran away and established free societies in an area which was geographically inaccessible for most Europeans. That is, in Brazil, for example, they would run off into the rainforest and up into the mountains in Jamaica, in Virginia to the dismal swamp areas.
Africans comprised about 12% of St. Augustine's population, and 1 in 5 was a free person.
And so it's possible that there may have been a few people who came here originally under some kind of free status. But it is not the case that this was the predominant mode of migration. The vast majority, 99 and 44, 100% of black people who came to the New World came as slaves or in chains.
They arrived aboard ships with Spanish conquistadors and brought many skills that they gained in Africa, including blacksmithing, carpentry, and cattle ranching.
Many of them were metal workers. Many of them also were, of course, hunters. Many of them also were skilled sculptors, worked with wood, worked with gold. And so they brought a tremendous number of skills with them.
Whereas the production of rice, for example, and indigo, and ship stores in the Carolinas required large numbers of slaves. The slaves worked in both disciplines, or they worked as gangs, or they worked individually doing task labor. In the Chesapeake, it is also the case, working in tobacco, that you need a trained and disciplined labor force to work there.
Free African Americans of Fort Mose worked side by side with Spaniards and Native Americans in the construction of Castillo de San Marcos. Records that have been found suggest they received pay for their labors. In 1763, the stroke of a pen did what nearly 200 years of pitched battles could not do. Spain gave Florida to Great Britain in exchange for newly conquered Havana. St. Augustine and all of Florida were now under British rule. The British occupied St. Augustine for the next 20 years. This included the years of the American Revolutionary War.
There's a long list of colonies that remained loyal to the British Empire. They tended to be places that had smaller colonial populations, that were more dependent upon military protection from the empire, more dependent upon direct trade with the empire. And Florida falls into that category.
All of Florida remained loyal to the British Crown during the American Revolution. Castillo de San Marcos became a British garrison, but was never engaged in any Revolutionary War battle. Following the Revolutionary War, under terms of a treaty signed by England, Florida once again returned to Spanish rule.
At the end of the Revolutionary War, the Spanish had conquered parts of Florida, and they received the rest as compensation to them.
The Spanish governorship of Florida lasted 37 years. In 1821, Spain sold Florida to the United States. On July 10th of that year, troops of the American Army took Florida under their control, and the Spanish left and never returned. In 1845, Florida became the 27th state admitted to the Union of the United States. In other programs in this series, we'll explore the early settlements of the English, the Spanish, French, and the Dutch, and discover more about the birth and the earliest formative years of our nation.